everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Ariane Blyvice, Marketing Manager at Kela. In today's session, our wonderful Alex Drury will take you through the fascinating world of ransomware negotiation tactics. Throughout the webinar, Alex will shed light on the tactics of Akira and Blackbuster, drawing from her extensive research. Alex, the stage is all yours.
Thank you, Ariane. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As Ariane mentioned, my name is Alex, and I'm a threat intelligence analyst here at Kela. And today I'm here to talk to you about ransomware, which continues to be a major threat to organizations globally. And today we'll be focusing on what happens after a victim has been attacked, and we will specifically be looking at how ransomware groups engage with their victims. We will be looking at how two groups in particular, Akira and Blackbuster, and how they conduct their negotiations with their victims. So just before going on to talking about these negotiations, I want to briefly talk about what Kela does. So Kela monitors the cybercrime ecosystem, and this ecosystem is comprised of sellers and buyers like any other financial system. And the ecosystem essentially consists of online sources, from marketplaces and forums to Telegram channels and even clear web websites. And as you can see, ransomware blogs, which we will discuss a bit about today, are also part of this ecosystem. And you can find various things being sold in the cybercrime ecosystem, including malware, database leaks, and other types of tools. And what the cybercrime ecosystem means is that no single threat actor needs to perform each stage of an attack, but instead they can purchase the relevant tools, credentials, and initial access online and use these to further advance their attack. So where does Kela come in? Kela collects information from these sources 24/7, and we ingest everything into our platform. And this data is turned into structured data to allow organizations to monitor for their exposure in cybercrime sources, allowing for timely mitigation measures when an exposure is identified. And Kela's insights serve various use cases, for example, cyber threat intelligence, as well as vulnerability and attack surface intelligence. And you can explore all of these use cases on Kela's website. So now into the content of today's webinar. As mentioned, today we will be looking at how Blackbuster and Akira conduct their negotiations, and I'll be specifically looking to answer some key questions. First, what tactics do these groups use to extort their victims? How much are the initial ransoms demanded by these groups? What is included in a ransom demand? So if a victim pays, what does the group provide in exchange for this payment? And if a victim wants to negotiate a ransom amount, are these groups willing to do so? And finally, do these groups follow through on their threats? So before going on to answering these questions, let's just take a step backwards and just get some background information of both of the groups that we'll be looking at today. So first, Akira. Akira is a ransomware group that was identified in March 2023. And since then, Kela has identified over 250 victims of Akira. And since Akira were identified, they have quickly become one of the most active ransomware and extortion actors, placing in the top 10 most active groups in 2023, with Kela identifying over 190 victims. As you can see, Akira has targeted organizations from a variety of countries, and the US accounts for nearly 2/3 of victims identified. Other top targeted countries include Canada, the UK, Australia, and Germany. And as for top targeted sectors, manufacturing and industrial products accounted for the most victims, and other top targeted sectors include professional services, technology, education, and engineering and construction. So now moving on to Blackbuster. Blackbuster is a ransomware group that was first observed in the wild in April 2022, although there is some evidence to suggest that the operation may have started as early as February 2022. And since its identification, Kela has identified over 450 victims of Blackbuster. And just like Akira, Blackbuster was among the most active ransomware and extortion actors in 2023, placing in the top 10. The US, just like Akira again, was the most targeted country by Blackbuster, accounting for more than half of victims. And other top targeted countries include Germany, the UK, Italy, and Canada. And as for top targeted sectors, like Akira, manufacturing and industrial products is the most targeted sector, and other targeted sectors include professional services, engineering and construction, consumer and retail, as well as transport and logistics. Now, the fact that the US is the most targeted country by both groups is consistent with the overall trend of ransomware and extortion actors, as well as the fact that manufacturing and industrial products and professional services are amongst the top two most targeted sectors by these groups, as Keller found that in 2023, these were the top two most targeted sectors by all ransomware and extortion actors tracked by Keller. Okay, so now that we have a bit of an understanding of these groups and their targeting, let's start looking at how they engage with their victims. Both Akira and Blackbuster leave ransom notes for their victims, and in these notes, they instruct their victims to get in contact. On the screen now, you can see an example of a Blackbuster ransom note, and you can see that the note includes a login ID here at the top of the note, as well as a link to their negotiation portal. Following this link, and inputting this login information will provide victims access to their chat with Blackbuster. And the Akira ransom note is very similar in the sense that it too provides the victim with a code, as well as a link to the negotiation portal, which you can see is provided at the bottom of their ransom notes. And again, accessing this chat provides the victims with access to their negotiation with Akira, where the negotiations will continue. So now let's start addressing those questions that I outlined at the start. The first, what tactics do these groups use to extort their victims? Akira and Blackbuster are both multi-extortion groups, and they appear to use two main extortion methods. First, they are ransomware groups, so they encrypt their victims' data. And secondly, like other ransomware groups, they also exfiltrate data prior to encryption, which they threaten to leak if a ransom is not paid. So looking at Akira more specifically, in the ransom note, they warn that they have encrypted and exfiltrated data. And they also threaten in this note that they will try to sell data that has value on the dark market. You can see that they specifically highlight certain types of data that they will try and sell, including personal information as well as source code. They also state that they will publish the data to their blog, and the threat of publishing data continues throughout Akira's interactions with their victims. It starts from the ransom note and continues throughout chats with the victims. And they've also been seen, in addition to threatening to publish this data, but also threatening to inform clients, partners, and employees of the breach. They also stated, as you can see, that in some cases, these clients, partners, and employees will be guided on how to file a claim properly, and we assess that this is likely referring to data breach lawsuits or other means by which victims can get compensation. Now, just as a quick note, based on negotiations reviewed by Keller, this does not appear to be a commonly used extortion method used by Akira. And Akira also threatened to name and shame their victims to their blog to try and extort a ransom out of them. So in negotiations that were not progressing to Akira's liking or where victims had not yet engaged with Akira, Akira named or threatened to name the victim to their news column. On the screen now, you can see the start of a negotiation chat with one of Akira's victims. And in this screenshot, there are no messages from the victim. They have not yet engaged with Akira. These are all messages from Akira themselves. And you can see that Akira warned, if the victim remains silent, we will have to announce your leak on our blog. And after that, upload your data there. Then, when the victim does not respond, Akira update that they have published the name of the victim to their news column and state that if the victim wants this post to be removed, then essentially a ransom has to be paid. So now moving on to discuss Blackbuster. Blackbuster uses the same techniques as Akira in terms of encrypting data and exfiltrating data and then threatening to release this data. Blackbuster threatened to share this data to their blog. They provide their victims with a link to a blog page, which they state that at the time is secret, but if an agreement is not made, it will be published. And they give their victims about 10 days to come to an agreement, and they provide a countdown on the blog. Blackbuster were also observed highlighting to one of their victims the types of data that was stolen and noted that the exposure of certain types of data is a violation under certain laws. Other ransomware and extortion actors are known to use similar threats in their ransom notes and blogs to help pressure victims into paying them. Another method that Keller observed Blackbuster use was alluding to the fact that they will give other actors access to the victim's network. So in this screenshot on the screen now, you can see that they state that our own efforts will lead to other bad entities being able to connect to your network. Now, this does not appear to be a common threat made by the group. Keller is only aware of it being made in several negotiations, and it was not a persistent threat made throughout the negotiation. It was mentioned in the initial opening message by the group, but it was not mentioned throughout the chat. Instead, the focus very much shifted towards the threat of data publication. And finally, like Akira, they also threaten to name a victim to their blog mid-negotiation if they feel like a victim is stalling. They were also observed threatening to delete the chat with the victim so that no further negotiations could take place. Okay, so now that we know how these groups try and extort a ransom out of their victims, let's look at how much the ransoms demanded by these groups are. So Akira claims that they have reviewed a number of types of documents, for example, bank statements and financial audits, to help them determine a ransom demand. And we've seen ransoms ranging between $105,000 to $3.7 million. And when comparing the ransom demanded with a company's revenue, we found that on average, Akira was observed asking for a ransom of around 3% of a victim's revenue. In one instance, they were seen asking for as much as 12%, and in another, as little as 0.1%. So what this large variation could suggest is that revenue might not be as significant as a factor when Akira are determining ransom demands. So now, as for Blackbuster, again, Keller has seen varying ransom amounts ranging between $500,000 to $6 million, and they were seen asking for ransoms of at least around 1.5% of a victim's revenue. Both Akira and Blackbuster present the result of a ransom payment as if it's a business transaction for services rendered. And the services provided in exchange for a ransom payment are the same. They provide decryption, evidence of data removal, and a security report. And the groups also state that they will provide some guarantees. For example, Akira states that they will not publish or sell data, in addition to guaranteeing that they will not attack the victim again in the future. And these guarantees are provided as a default if any of the other services are purchased. And as for Blackbuster, in some but not all negotiations seen by Keller, Blackbuster says that they will guarantee that they will not attack the victim again. Akira allows their victims to pick and choose which services they want. So they don't need to pay for the full set of services, but they can pick and choose. And Akira will provide pricing dependent on the service that the victim wants, and will also provide a full breakdown of the initial ransom demands. And what we saw at Keller was that decryption assistance normally was the most expensive service offered by Kira, and it usually accounted for around 50% to 70% of the ransom demanded. Evidence of data removal accounted for around 25 to 50%, and the security report accounted for less than 10%. As for Blackbuster doesn't outrightly offer their victims the chance to pick and choose which services they want to pay for. However, if victims ask, there is precedent of Blackbuster allowing this. So at Keller, we are aware of victims looking to only pay for the data removal, for example, and in these instances, Blackbuster was observed treating the decryption and data removal services as financially equal and offering a 50% discount if only one of the services was desired. So if a victim wants to negotiate a ransom amount, are the groups willing to do so? And in short, yes. Both of these groups have shown that they're willing to negotiate, with victims succeeding in negotiating substantial discounts off the initial ransom demanded. Akira is willing to negotiate prices for the full set of services as well as for the individual services. So, for example, just the evidence of data removal. And from the negotiations seen by Keller, on average, Akira were observed agreeing to discounts of around 40%. The smallest discount observed was 6%, whilst the highest discount agreed to was 90%. And on several occasions, we've seen Akira noting that they would not accept an amount less than 6 figures. And that is true to what we have seen. We have not actually seen Akira accepting a ransom amount for the full set of services that is less than 6 figures. As for Blackbuster, Blackbuster has also been agreed to varying ransom discounts, ranging from 38% to 95%. And we've seen several instances of them accepting ransoms for amounts 90% less than what was initially demanded. And not only are Blackbuster willing to negotiate on price, but also on time. If you remember when we were discussing the various extortion methods used by the groups, I mentioned that Blackbuster have a countdown on their negotiation portal, and that they provide their victims with about 10 days to come to an agreement. We have seen them extending this countdown if requested by a victim. So before going on to look at the final question, which is whether these groups follow through on their threats, let's quickly discuss if they also honor their word, meaning did they provide the victims who paid with the agreed upon services? We saw that in general, these groups do provide the agreed upon services. And as a reminder, this is referring to data removal, decryption, and the security report. However, whilst they have been seen providing these services, certain victims have had issues when receiving them, for example, having to wait a prolonged time for the services, as well as some victims experiencing issues with decryption. And also, if you remember, one of the extortion methods used by both groups was the naming of victims to their blogs mid-negotiation. And in these instances, if a victim was named but then later paid the ransom, Keller observed that these initial posts were deleted from the blogs. Just as a separate note, Keller did see that Akira would promise some victims that their negotiation chats would be deleted. However, some of these chats are still available. So we haven't touched on the security report provided by these groups yet. So let's quickly look at this. So both Blackbuster and Akira provide their victims with a security report if they pay the ransom. And as you can see, Blackbuster states that the security report will cover how the victim was hacked and how to fix vulnerabilities in the future to avoid similar situations. As for Akira, they state that the report covers the vulnerabilities they found and how they were able to gain access to the victim's network. They also state that the report will include technical recommendations on how the victim can eliminate vulnerabilities and how they can secure their internal and external infrastructure. And in the case of Akira, the security report is a paid-for service. You can see a breakdown of a ransom demand now on the screen. And in this example, the security report cost $75,000. And Keller has observed prices for the security report ranging between $10,000 to $75,000. So a key finding of Keller's is that we saw that Akira provided victims who paid for the security report with the exact same report, and the same for Blackbuster. Victims who received the report received the exact same version of the report. And both reports are not reports per se, and they follow a very similar format. They are not very long, and they are just provided in the negotiation chat rather than a separate document, for example. Both reports contain information on how the group gained initial access to the victim, as well as some generic security recommendations. So let's look at an Akira security report specifically. On the screen now, you can see that report. And as a reminder, this is the same report that was provided to all victims who paid to receive one. You can see that the first part of the report contains information on the attack chain, including information on how Akira gained initial access to a company. They specify that initial access was purchased on the dark web. They also include some generic security recommendations. For example, you can see that they recommend the use of strong passwords, that MFA should be implemented, as well as that software should be updated. All very general security recommendations. So, as I mentioned, each of the security reports provided by both groups to the victims who received one were the same. However, just because the reports are the same does not necessarily mean that the information in them is false. For both Akira and Blackbuster, the initial access vector indicated in the security reports is consistent with known TTPs of the group. So again, looking at Akira, as the report specifies, initial access to the victim's network was purchased on the dark web. And the use of unauthorized logins to VPN accounts is a known technique used by the group to gain initial access. And credentials for these accounts could have been purchased in cybercrime sources, just like Akira state. For example, credentials could have been stolen from devices that have been infected with information stealing malware, and these credentials could then be sold or shared in Clouds of Logs Telegram channels or in cybercrime markets. On the screen now, you can see a screenshot taken from Keller's platform, specifically the compromised accounts module. And these are VPN credentials for a victim of Akira that were shared or offered for sale a couple of months before the victim was identified by Keller. Access can also be purchased on different platforms, for instance, in cybercrime forums where initial access brokers are selling access. On the screen now, you can see a post from a cybercrime forum in which an actor is advertising VPN access to 2 companies from the USA. So to recap on the security report, the reports provided by both groups to their victims are the same. And the reports contain information on initial access vector and security recommendations. Now, the fact that the security reports provided by both groups are the same for each victim does not necessarily mean that the information in the reports are false, as the initial access vectors are consistent with known TTPs. So, It is possible that the information provided in these reports is true. However, most of the information they provide is generic, and it is not the exclusive first-hand information that Akira has been seen promising. For example, there are no specifics provided in terms of account initially accessed. So now to address the final question, do these groups follow through on their threats? At the start of the session, we discussed some of the different extortion methods used by these groups, specifically around the exfiltration of data and then threatening to leak this data if a ransom is not paid. So do they actually follow through on these threats? And in general, they do. Victims that do not pay the ransom should be prepared to be named on the group's blogs, as well as for data to be published. Now, for unknown reasons, Akira does not always follow through on their threats. First, we discussed when discussing the extortion methods used by the group that they threatened to sell data if a ransom was not paid. And at Keller, we have not identified any evidence of them publicly doing so. Also, victims that do not pay the ransom do not always have their data leaked. For example, on the screen now, you can see a screenshot taken from Keller's platform. And this is an event in which Keller identified a victim of Akira on June 16th, 2023. And we are aware that the victim did not pay the ransom. A couple of days later, on June 23rd, you can see that the victim was posted to the Akira news column. However, now, nearly a year after the attack was claimed, still no data has been published by the group concerning this victim. And finally, some victims do not appear on the blog at all, so they don't have their data leaked and they are not named and shamed. So that is the end of the content of today's webinar. So let's just quickly discuss some mitigations that organizations can implement to help prevent and protect from such attacks. So although it's not illegal to do so, many countries advise against paying a ransom, and paying the ransom should not be considered an effective response strategy. So instead, organizations should look to implement security controls that can help prevent and mitigate ransomware and extortion attacks. And this can include implementing training that teaches employees about the most common cyber threats today and how to recognize potentially suspicious behavior. Organizations should also implement a password policy and ensure that it's enforced across all company systems. Employees should also be educated on good password hygiene, including the importance of not reusing passwords or using similar passwords across multiple accounts. And multi-factor authentication should also be enforced on accounts where possible. And organizations should also ensure that logging is in place on key systems to help identify suspicious and unauthorized activity. And they should also maintain offline backups of critical data. Organizations should regularly test the availability and integrity of these backups. They should also implement an incident response plan that is tested on an annual basis to ensure its effectiveness. Organizations should also procure access to a cyber threat intelligence platform so that they can monitor threats to their organization in a timely manner and also take the necessary mitigation measures if an exposure is identified. For example, compromised accounts or network access sales that could be used by ransomware actors to gain initial access to their environment. And finally, organizations should research known TTPs of ransomware and extortion actors so that they can effectively implement mitigation measures to prevent such attacks, but also ensure that if an attack takes place, they can respond effectively. So to help you with monitoring cybercrime sources, Keller offers a 2-week free trial of our platform, allowing you to be notified about any threats targeting your organization. And once you register, we will reach out to you to help you set up a monitor to track your assets. and we will walk you through the platform to make sure that you get the most out of your 2-week free trial. Also, if you found this topic interesting and you'd like to learn more, you can scan the QR code there on the right to read the full version of the report. Okay, and finally, if anybody has any questions, I'm aware that we're running slightly short on time, but I'd be happy to answer anything. 1 second, let me check. Okay, we have one question about a lot of ransomware and extortion groups are Russian speakers. Do I need to know Russian to negotiate? No, actually, a lot of these groups conduct their negotiations in English, as can be seen from the screenshots I've shown you in the webinar today. Another question, who are the victims talking to when they are negotiating? So this actually depends on the group. For Akira specifically, it looks like the negotiations are conducted by a team or a person who is specifically in charge of negotiations. We've seen them referring to themselves as a mediator and stating that they don't have the authority to make decisions. We've also seen them referring to the fact that upper management or bosses or their leadership needs to approve ransom amounts. And actually having specific individuals or teams responsible for certain aspects of an extortion operation is something that Keller has observed among the more sophisticated ransomware and extortion groups. In contrast, Lockbit, which has been the most active ransomware and extortion actor for quite a bit of time, for them, it's actually the affiliates who conduct the negotiations. So they do provide guidelines on certain aspects of the negotiation. For example, affiliates are not permitted to accept a ransom demand below a certain amount, and they also provide guidance on how to set initial ransom demands. However, the negotiation is conducted by the affiliate themselves. A question on what grounds did these groups accept a lower ransom amount, or how do I negotiate a lower ransom amount? So this appears to be really case dependent, and that's evidenced by the wide variation of discount rates that I discussed earlier on in the webinar, with the highest for Akira being 90% and the lowest being 6%. So there doesn't appear to be a clear-cut kind of method or solution to getting them to come down in price. In some instances, we've seen that these groups are not willing to budge that much on their initial ransom demand, whereas in other instances, they have agreed to substantial discounts. Actually, just the other day, we saw Akira providing a victim with the decryptor for free. One consistent kind of reason for giving discounts by both groups was if victims can secure fast payments, then they would offer a certain percentage of the initial ransom demanded. However, again, paying a ransom should not be considered an effective strategy or rushed into to secure that discount. Instead, if victims are considering to possibly negotiate, they need to really make sure that they verify the claims of the actors first. Then there's also one question about the mode of negotiation, I think that is referring to mentioning email or call. So yeah, so these two groups specifically, I mentioned that they do their negotiations over a negotiation chat. So it's essentially like an online chat platform that victims are provided with private access to their chat room. However, not all ransomware and extortion actors use this method. Some use email, some also use talks, and some actually have contact forms on their leak sites, which they instruct victims to go out and fill out the contact form. And with that, I'm conscious that we are slightly over time, so I will have to end it there. However, if there are any questions not answered, please don't hesitate to get in contact with us, and we would be happy to answer those for you. Thank you so much.